The rain-slicked pavement blurred as Jae-yoon twisted her arm, the fabric of her coat tearing in Tae-hoon's grip. She lunged toward the main road, desperate for any light, any witness, only to collide with a chest as solid as iron. She looked up, gasping for air, and found herself trapped between her past and a man whose eyes held the cold, dark depth of the abyss. Trembling and soaked to the bone, Jae-yoon could only stare at the man in the tailored charcoal suit. Cha Seung-woo didn't look at the screaming man behind her. He reached out, his leather-gloved thumb tilting her chin toward the street lamp. "Who gave you that bruise?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to still the very rain. Before she could find her voice, Tae-hoon skidded to a halt behind her, shouting about his woman and his business. Seung-woo didn't flinch. He simply shifted his gaze over Jae-yoon's shoulder, a silent, predatory look that turned Tae-hoon's bravado into a choked, terrified silence. The transition from the freezing, rain-lashed street to the stillness of the penthouse was a blur of velvet upholstery and the rhythmic hum of a high-end engine. When Jae-yoon finally opened her eyes, the first thing she felt was the unnatural softness of the sheets. They were silk, cool against her skin, a jarring contrast to the rough polyester of the bedding she'd shared with Tae-hoon. She sat up too quickly, a hiss of pain escaping her lips as the bruise on her eye throbbed in protest. The room was expansive, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking a Seoul skyline that looked like a scattering of fallen diamonds. It was a view reserved for the gods of the city, not for a florist who smelled of damp earth and cheap detergent. Fear, sharp and cold, spiked in her chest. She looked down at herself. Someone had removed her sodden coat and shoes, replacing them with a heavy, cream-colored robe that felt like a second skin. "You're awake." The voice was like low-frequency thunder. Jae-yoon flinched, pulling the robe tighter around her throat as she tracked the sound. Cha Seung-woo sat in a leather armchair in the shadows of the corner, a crystal glass of amber liquid resting on his knee. He hadn't changed his clothes, but his jacket was off, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the stark, powerful lines of his throat. "Where am I?" Her voice came out as a fragile rasp. "Where is Tae-hoon?" Seung-woo stood, his movements possessing a predatory grace that made the large room feel suddenly very small. He walked toward the bed, stopping just outside her personal space. Light from the city silhouette caught the sharp bridge of his nose and the uncompromising set of his jaw. "You are in a place where no one can touch you without my permission," he said. His gaze dropped to her face, lingering on the purple swelling of her eye. His jaw tightened, a flicker of that controlled nuclear energy she had witnessed in the rain. As for the man who did that, he is currently learning that some debts cannot be paid in cash. Jae-yoon scrambled toward the headboard, her knuckles white as she gripped the silk duvet. "I can't stay here. I don't have money. If you think I can pay you for, I didn't bring you here for a transaction, Jae-yoon." The way he said her name, with a familiarity that felt like a secret, stopped the air in her lungs. She looked at him, really looked at him, trying to find the monster she knew he must be. He was the head of a syndicate, a man whose name was whispered in back alleys to instill terror. Yet as he reached out, he didn't grab her. He placed a small, silver tray on the nightstand, a glass of water, a single white pill, and a damp, warm cloth. "The world thinks I am a man who takes what he wants," he murmured, leaning in just enough for her to catch the scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco. "And perhaps I am. But from you I am only asking for your recovery. Sleep. The doors are locked from the outside, not to keep you in, but to keep the world out." He turned to leave, but Jae-yoon found a sudden spark of desperate courage. Why me?" Seung-woo paused at the door, his silhouette framed against the dim hallway light. He didn't look back, but his voice carried a weight that made her heart skip. "Because once, a long time ago, you gave something to a boy who had nothing. Now I'm a man who has everything, and I find I still owe you interest." The heavy door clicked shut with a sound of finality. Jae-yoon lay back, staring at the ceiling, trapped in a cage made of gold and silk. She was safe for the first time in years, but as she listened to the hum of the city below, she realized that being saved by a monster might be just as dangerous as being hunted by one. The air in the basement of the Golden Dragon Social Club was thick with the scent of stale charcoal smoke and unwashed fear. 3 men sat around a scarred mahogany table, their expressions a mix of wary greed and primal instinct. These were the city's bottom feeders, the lone sharks who held the leashes of 1,000 desperate souls. When the heavy steel door creaked open, the room went unnervingly silent. Cha Seung-woo walked in alone, his tailored coat draped over his shoulders like a shroud. He didn't look like a man entering a den of thieves. He looked like a god descending into a tomb. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the screech of wood against concrete sounding like a death knell. "I believe you all hold a certain set of markers," Seung-woo began, his voice a silk-wrapped blade. He didn't wait for an invitation. He signaled to a man in the shadows, and a thick leather briefcase was placed on the table with a heavy thud. "Kim Tae-hoon, I want every contract, every digital record, and every blood-stained napkin he assigned his name to." The eldest shark, a man with a jagged scar across his throat, let out a nervous chuckle. "Mr. Cha, we didn't know the boy was yours. If he's a friend of the syndicate—" "He is not a friend," Seung-woo interrupted, his eyes darkening into obsidian. He leaned forward, the light reflecting off the sharp gold of his signet ring. "He is a debt that I am calling in, personally." The sharks exchanged looks. They knew Tae-hoon was a degenerate gambler, a man who had sold his soul for one more hand of poker. To them, he was a source of interest. To Seung-woo, he was an infestation. "He owes nearly 200 million won across the three of us," the scarred man whispered, sliding a folder toward Seung-woo, "including the interest from his most recent incidents." Seung-woo flipped through the papers, his expression unreadable as he saw the dates. Each loan correlated with a night Jae-yoon had likely spent in terror. He saw the predatory interest rates, the threats written in the margins. He snapped the folder shut. "Triple the total," Seung-woo said, his voice dropping an octave. "I am buying the principal, the interest, and the right to his life. From this moment on, Kim Tae-hoon does not owe you a single one. He owes me, and I am a much less patient creditor." The briefcase was clicked open, revealing stacks of high-denomination bills that seemed to glow under the dim yellow light. The greed in the room became palpable, a sickening heat. One by one, the lone sharks signed the transfer of debt, their hands trembling as they realized they weren't just selling a contract, they were handing over a man's execution warrant. Seung-woo stood, the folders tucked under his arm. He didn't look at the money again. To him, the cash was a triviality, the power it bought was absolute. "If I hear that any of you have contacted him, or if you so much as breathe his name in a bar, I will consider it a breach of contract," he said, pausing at the door. He turned back, his gaze chilling the room to sub-zero temperatures. "And I don't sue for damages. I collect them in skin." He stepped back out into the cool night air, where his black sedan waited like a crouching predator. He watched the smoke from his cigarette curl into the moonlight, thinking of the woman sleeping in his silk sheets. He had removed the sharks from the water, but he wasn't finished. He didn't just want Tae-hoon broke, he wanted him erased. He wanted the man to realize that there was nowhere on earth he could run where the debt wouldn't find him. Seung-woo climbed into the back seat and tapped the glass. "Find him. Bring him to the warehouse. I want to show him exactly what his life is worth." The morning light in the penthouse was too bright, a clinical white that seemed to expose every flaw Jae-yoon tried to hide. She stood by the window, her fingers tracing the seam of the cream robe, until the door opened. Seung-woo didn't ask if she was ready. He simply stood there, a silent command in his posture, and waited for her to follow him. The boutique was situated on a quiet, tree-lined street in Gangnam. A place with no sign on the door and a security guard who bowed so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. Inside, the air smelled of expensive lilies and floor wax. Mannequins stood like skeletal sentinels, draped in silks that cost more than Jae-yoon's flower shop earned in a year. "Mr. Cha, an honor," the manager whispered, fluttering toward them. Seung-woo ignored the greeting. He steered Jae-yoon toward a sprawling triptych of mirrors at the back of the store. The glass was so clear it felt like a confrontation. He didn't let go of her arm until she was centered, forced to look at the girl in the reflection. The one with the sallow skin, the dark blooming bruise, and the hunched shoulders of someone who had spent too long trying to be invisible. "Choose," Seung-woo said, his voice echoing in the minimalist space. Jae-yoon looked at the racks of designer evening wear, then back at her own feet. I can't, I don't belong here, I'm sorry, I should just stop. The word wasn't loud, but it cut through her apology like a wire. Seung-woo stepped behind her, his reflection looming over hers. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his grip firm but not crushing, forcing her to stay upright. I'm sorry, she whispered again, a reflex, a habit of survival. That is the last time you will use those words in my presence, he said, his eyes locking onto hers in the mirror. You apologize for the space you take up. You apologize for the air you breathe. You apologize to the man who struck you because you think your existence provoked him. Jae-yoon tried to look away, but his gaze held her captive. It's a lot. I don't know how to be this person. You aren't being a person yet, Jae-yoon, you are being a shadow. He leaned down, his breath warm against her ear, though his tone remained as cold as a winter tide. Look at yourself, not the bruise, look at the woman beneath it. She is the one I remembered, she is the one who didn't flinch when the world was bleeding. Why are you flinching now? He signaled to the manager. Within seconds, a silk dress the color of crushed rubies was brought forward. It was bold, unapologetic, and dangerous. Put it on, he commanded. When she emerged from the fitting room minutes later, the transformation was jarring. The deep red fabric masked her fragility, turning her pale skin into porcelain. The bruise remained, a jagged violet mark, but against the elegance of the silk, it no longer looked like a badge of shame. It looked like a battle scar. Seung-woo walked a slow circle around her. He reached out, his fingers hovering just an inch from the injury before dropping to her chin. He lifted her face until she was forced to meet his stare without shrinking. The world will take everything you give it, he murmured. If you give it your back, it will whip you. If you give it your silence, it will bury you. From today, you give it nothing but your presence. He turned to the manager, sliding a black card across the glass counter without looking at the price. Everything she touched, send it to the penthouse, and burn the clothes she arrived in. As they walked back to the car, Jae-yoon didn't hunch her shoulders. She felt the weight of the silk, the sharpness of Seung-woo's expectations, and for the first time, a flicker of something that wasn't fear. It was a cold, quiet realization. If she was to survive the monster who had saved her, she would have to stop being the victim he had found in the rain. The penthouse was silent, save for the low hum of the climate control and the distant, muffled pulse of the city below. Seung-woo had been called away to a meeting that sounded like a funeral curt, whispered phone calls and the sharp snap of a pistol holster being adjusted beneath his blazer. He had left Jae-yoon with a single instruction: stay within the glass. But the glass was a mirror, and the mirror still showed a woman she didn't recognize. Restless and draped in the heavy silk of her new life, Jae-yoon found herself drawn toward the heavy double doors at the end of the north corridor. His office. The room smelled of old paper, expensive scotch, and the same sandalwood scent that clung to Seung-woo's skin. It was a masculine sanctuary, devoid of sentiment, filled with high-backed leather and mahogany. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped inside, feeling like a trespasser in a lion's den. She wasn't looking for secrets, but for a reason, some scrap of logic that explained why a man who ruled the underworld would waste a second glance on a broken florist. On his desk sat a small, lacquered box, its surface inlaid with mother-of-pearl. It was the only thing in the room that didn't look functional or threatening. Slowly, her fingers trembling, Jae-yoon lifted the lid. Inside, resting atop a bed of black velvet, was a piece of fabric. It was a simple cotton handkerchief, once white, now yellowed with age and stiffened by dark, rusty stains that time had failed to erase. In the corner, stitched in faded blue thread, was a small, clumsy embroidery of a lily, the same mark she had used on her shop's apron since she was 19. Jae-yoon felt the floor tilt beneath her. The air in the room grew thin as the years collapsed. 10 years ago, a rainy alleyway behind the marketplace. She had been closing her mother's flower stall when she found him, a boy no older than 17, his face a mask of blood and grit, his knuckles split to the bone. He had looked like a stray dog waiting for the final blow. She hadn't asked his name. She had simply knelt in the mud, pressed her handkerchief to his gashed temple, and told him that the world wasn't always this cruel. "You kept it," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. I told you A voice came from the doorway, startling her so violently the box nearly slipped from her hands. Seung-woo stood there, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the hall light. He didn't look angry that she had invaded his privacy, he looked exposed. He walked toward her, the sound of his leather soles on the hardwood sounding like a countdown. "I was a nameless street fighter with nothing but a grudge," he said, stopping inches away. He reached into the box and touched the fabric with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. That piece of cloth was the first thing I ever owned that wasn't stolen or stained with someone else's blood. It was the only proof I had that I existed to someone who wasn't trying to kill me. Jae-yoon looked from the blood-stained relic to the man standing before her. The unbelievable truth wasn't that he was a monster. It was that the monster had been built around a single act of kindness she had long ago forgotten. "You've been looking for me all this time?" she asked, her voice a mere breath. Seung-woo's hand moved from the box to her cheek, his thumb tracing the edge of her bruise with an agonizingly slow tenderness. "I didn't just look for you, Jae-yoon. I built an empire so that when I finally found you, no one would ever be able to make you bleed again." The air in the basement of the estate was heavy, filtered through industrial vents that couldn't quite strip the smell of damp concrete and metallic cold. Jae-yoon stood at the edge of the shadows, her fingers digging into the silk of her robe. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single harsh bulb, sat Kim Tae-hoon. He wasn't the monster who had loomed over her in the rain. Stripped of his bravado and his leather jacket, he looked pathetic, small, trembling, and covered in a fine sheen of cold sweat. When he saw her, his eyes widened with a frantic, desperate light. "Jae-yoon, Jae-yoon, please," he sobbed, the sound echoing off the sterile walls. Tell this madman that I love you. I was just stressed, the money. The sharks were pressing me. You know how I get. Please just tell him to let me go. I'll change. We can leave Seoul tonight." Jae-yoon took a faltering step forward. The victim's guilt she had carried like a shroud for years began to pulse in her chest. She remembered the early days, the shared meals, the way he had once protected her from a rowdy customer. She looked at his bruised knuckles and felt a sickening wave of familiar pity. "Seung-woo," she whispered, her voice trembling. Is this necessary? He looks like he's had enough." Seung-woo was leaning against a steel pillar, his arms crossed, watching the scene with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an insect. At her words, he straightened, his expression shifting from boredom to a sharp, dangerous clarity. "He looks like a man who has run out of cards to play," Seung-woo said, his voice a low, terrifying calm. He walked toward the chair, circling Tae-hoon like a shark sensing a final, frantic heartbeat. "You want to save him, Jae-yoon. You want to return to the man who loves you." He reached into his inner breast pocket and pulled out a small digital tablet, tossing it onto the table in front of her. "Before you offer your mercy, you should understand what he was willing to trade for his life." Jae-yoon looked down at the screen. It was a recording of a phone call, timestamped 3 nights ago, the night before Seung-woo had found her in the rain. "I've got her," Tae-hoon's voice crackled through the speakers, devoid of the sobbing desperation he was currently performing. "She's clean, she's quiet, and she's got no family to go looking. If you clear my gambling debt at the Golden Dragon, you can take her. Use her for the clubs, sell her off, I don't care. Just wipe the slate." The silence that followed the recording was absolute. Jae-yoon felt the world tilt. The man who had just begged for her love had been bartering her body like a piece of livestock to the very shark Seung-woo had silenced. Tae-hoon's sobbing stopped instantly. He looked up at her, his face twisting from a mask of grief into a snarl of pure, ugly resentment. I was going to die, Jae-yoon. What was one girl compared to? Seung-woo's hand moved faster than the eye could follow. He didn't strike him. He simply gripped Tae-hoon's jaw, forcing the man to look up into the abyss of his eyes. "The predator's mercy is not for the likes of you," Seung-woo murmured, his voice barely a breath. He looked back at Jae-yoon, his gaze softening only for her. "He didn't just hit you, Jae-yoon. He tried to erase you. Now you decide. Do we let the law of the street take its course, or do you still feel the need to apologize for surviving him?" Jae-yoon looked at Tae-hoon, really looked at him, and saw the void where a human soul should be. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply turned her back on the light, walking toward the stairs. "Do whatever you have to," she said, her voice steady and cold. I'm going home. Behind her, the shadows seemed to swallow the room, and for the first time, she didn't fear the monster walking beside her. The ballroom of the Grand Shilla was a cavern of gold leaf and crystal, filled with the kind of predatory elegance that made the air feel thin. This was the inner sanctum of the syndicate, a gathering of men who moved nations and women who wore diamonds like armor. When the double doors swung open, a hush rippled through the crowd, starting at the edges and crashing toward the center. Jae-yoon felt the weight of 100 gazes, sharp as scalpels, dissecting her. She was draped in the crushed ruby silk Seung-woo had chosen, the fabric clinging to her frame with a defiant shimmer. Beside her, Seung-woo was a pillar of shadow and authority, his hand resting firmly at the small of her back. He didn't guide her so much as he anchored her. "Breathe," he murmured, his voice a private vibration against the roar of the room. "They are looking for a victim, don't give them one." As they descended the marble staircase, a woman in emerald satin, the widow of a fallen lieutenant known for her venom, stepped into their path. She eyed the faint, fatting bruise on Jae-yoon's temple with a thin, mocking smile. "So this is the little florist everyone is whispering about," the woman purred, her voice carrying just enough to reach the surrounding tables. "A delicate thing. I wonder, Mr. Cha, does she know how easily wildflowers are crushed in this city? Or perhaps she's just here to decorate the room until the seasons change." A soft, cruel titter of laughter followed. Jae-yoon felt the old familiar heat of shame rising in her throat, the urge to apologize for simply existing in such a grand space. She felt Seung-woo's hand tighten slightly on her waist, a silent reminder of the handkerchief and the girl who hadn't flinched in the rain. Jae-yoon didn't look down. She met the woman's eyes, her spine straightening until she felt the silk of her dress pull taut. "Wildflowers are hardy," Jae-yoon said, her voice clear and surprisingly steady. "They survive the winter, the rain, and the heels of anyone careless enough to step on them. I think I'll find the climate here quite manageable." The laughter died instantly. The widow's smile faltered, her gaze flickering to Seung-woo, who was watching Jae-yoon with an expression that was dangerously close to pride. He didn't speak for her. He allowed her words to hang in the air like a challenge. "It seems my partner has a sharp eye for more than just roses," Seung-woo said, his gaze sweeping the room with a chilling finality. "If anyone else has concerns about her decor, I suggest you bring them to me, personally." He led her toward the center of the floor, the crowd parting like a black sea. For the first time, Jae-yoon didn't feel like a guest in a golden cage. She felt the power of the man beside her, but more than that, she felt the spark of her own emerging strength. She wasn't just a survivor of the streets anymore. She was the first lady of a kingdom built on blood and loyalty. As the music swelled and the elite of the underworld bowed their heads in silent acknowledgement, Jae-yoon realized that the unbelievable part of her story wasn't the rescue. It was the fact that she was finally learning to look the world in the eye and watch it blink first. The neon lights of the red light district flickered in the greasy puddles of the alleyway, casting jagged shadows against the brick. Kim Tae-hoon sat in the back of a rusted van, his hands shaking so violently he had to sit on them to keep from making a sound. He had escaped the warehouse, not through skill, but because he was a cockroach that knew how to find the cracks. Now he was playing his final hand. Across from him sat Choi, a lieutenant for the 7 Stars, the only syndicate with enough blood on their hands to rival Seung-woo's. Choi smelled of cheap menthols and expensive gunpowder, his eyes devoid of anything resembling empathy. "You're wasting my time, gambler," Choi rasped, flicking an ash onto the floor mat. "Why should I care about a fallen soldier like you?" Tae-hoon leaned forward, his voice a frantic whisper. "Because I know his weakness. Everyone thinks Cha Seung-woo is a stone, but he's gone soft. He's hiding a girl in that penthouse, a florist. She's the only thing he values more than his territory." Choi paused, the cherry of his cigarette glowing bright. "A girl? Seung-woo doesn't have a heart, he has a ledger. He kept a bloody rag she gave him 10 years ago," Tae-hoon hissed, his face twisting with a mix of fear and spite. "He's vulnerable. I can give you the security codes to the service elevator. I can tell you the rotation of his personal guard. In exchange, I want 2 things, passage out of the country and the girl. I want Jae-yoon back." Tae-hoon's mind was a fever dream of revenge. He didn't want Jae-yoon because he loved her. He wanted her because she was the only thing that had ever truly belonged to him, and seeing her stand in that red silk had felt like a hot iron to his pride. He wanted to break her back down to the woman who flinched at the sound of his footsteps. Choi looked at the scribbled notes Tae-hoon pushed across the seat, codes, shift patterns, the layout of the estate. The information was gold. It was the blueprint for a coup. "You'd sell your savior's secrets just to get a woman back in your cage?" Choi asked, a smirk playing on his lips. "He's not my savior. He's a thief who took what was mine," Tae-hoon spat. "Do we have a deal?" Choi signaled to his driver. The engine hummed to life, a low, ominous vibration that felt like the beginning of a storm. "We have a deal. We take the territory. You take the girl. But if a single one of these codes is wrong, I'll make sure you're still alive when the crows start picking at your eyes." Tae-hoon nodded frantically, ignoring the chill that raced down his spine. He told himself he was winning. He told himself he was the one in control. But as the van pulled out into the midnight traffic, moving toward the shimmering glass tower where Jae-yoon slept, he failed to realize that in the underworld, a gambler who bets everything on a betrayal usually ends up paying with more than just his life. High above the city, in the silence of the penthouse, Jae-yoon stirred in her sleep, unaware that the ghost of her past was currently leading a pack of wolves to her door. The shattering of the floor-to-ceiling glass sounded like 1,000 crystal bells screaming at once. The explosion of light and sound ripped Jae-yoon from a dream of white lilies into a nightmare of gunpowder and shadows. She rolled off the bed instinctively, the silk of her nightdress tangling around her legs as black-clad figures swarmed through the jagged gap in the skyline. The golden cage was being breached. Shouts erupted from the hallway, the sharp, rhythmic cracks of suppressed gunfire, as Seung-woo's private guard met the invaders. "Jae-yoon." Tae-hoon's voice sliced through the chaos, shrill and manic. He stepped through the broken window, flanked by 2 men from the 7 stars. He looked unhinged, his eyes darting around the luxury he could never possess. "Get up," he hissed, lunging for her. "I'm taking you back. You don't belong in a palace. You belong in the dirt with me." Jae-yoon scrambled backward, her hand catching on the lacquered box on the nightstand. It slid across the floor, the lid popping open to reveal the yellowed, blood-stained handkerchief. In that moment, the fear that had defined her life for years, the shivering, paralyzing dread of Tae-hoon's hand, met the memory of the boy in the rain. She wasn't the girl in the alleyway anymore. She was the woman who had stood before the mafia elite in ruby silk. Tae-hoon grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into the bone. "Don't fight me, you know how this ends." "It ends now," Jae-yoon whispered. She didn't flinch, she didn't beg. As he pulled her toward the window, she reached for the heavy crystal carafe on the bedside table. With a scream that was less about terror and more about a decade of suppressed rage, she swung. The glass shattered against the side of his head, sending him reeling back toward the jagged remains of the window. Blood, dark and hot, sprayed across the white linens. Tae-hoon slumped to his knees, clutching his face, his bravado dissolving into a pathetic whimper. One of the rival gunmen leveled his weapon at her, his finger tightening on the trigger. Jae-yoon closed her eyes, bracing for the impact she had spent her life expecting. The hit never came. A single shot rang out, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. Jae-yoon opened her eyes to see Seung-woo standing in the doorway. His white shirt was splattered with crimson, his expression a mask of absolute murderous calm. He didn't look at the fallen gunmen. His eyes were locked on Jae-yoon, who stood amidst the glass and blood, her chest heaving, the broken neck of the carafe still clutched in her hand like a dagger. He walked toward her, stepping over Tae-hoon as if he were nothing more than a piece of discarded trash. He didn't take the weapon from her hand. He simply placed his palm over her white-knuckled grip, his warmth grounding her. "You didn't wait for me to save you," he murmured, his voice thick with something that sounded like reverence. Jae-yoon looked down at her hands. They were shaking, but they weren't empty. She looked at Tae-hoon, who was being dragged away by Seung-woo's men, and realized she felt nothing. No pity, no guilt, no fear. The woman who took the hit had died when the glass broke. "I'm done waiting," she said, her voice turning to steel. The scent of ozone and gunpowder had been replaced by the crisp, biting fragrance of white orchids. The penthouse had been restored to its former clinical perfection, the shattered glass swept away as if the violence of the night before had been nothing more than a fevered dream. Jae-yoon stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the sunrise bleed across the Seoul skyline. Below, the city was waking up, oblivious to the shift in the underworld's tectonic plates. Tae-hoon was gone. Seung-woo hadn't given her the details and she hadn't asked. Some debts were settled in silence, and the weight of that man's existence had finally been lifted from her shoulders, leaving a vacuum of peace she was still learning to breathe in. The heavy doors clicked shut behind her. She didn't flinch. She knew the rhythm of his step, the specific gravity he brought into a room. "The 7 stars have retreated," Seung-woo said, his voice a low, steady anchor. "Their leaders have been reminded of the cost of trespassing." He stopped a few feet behind her. The reflection of the glass, Jae-yoon saw him watching her. He looked different. The controlled nuclear energy was still there, but the predatory edge had softened into something deeper, something permanent. "And Tae-hoon?" she asked, her voice calm. "He will never see the sun rise over this city again," Seung-woo replied. "He has been sent to a place where his name means nothing and his debts follow him like a shadow. He is a ghost now, Jae-yoon. He can no longer haunt you." Jae-yoon turned to face him. She was wearing a gown of ivory silk, her hair swept back to reveal the temple where the bruise had finally faded to a faint, ghostly yellow. She looked at the man who had built a kingdom of shadows just to find the girl who had once shown him mercy. "You've spent 10 years building this sanctuary for me," she said softly. "But I don't want to just be kept safe, Seung-woo. I want to be by your side." Seung-woo's gaze intensified, a flash of raw, unfiltered emotion breaking through his ironclad composure. He reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out a handkerchief or a digital tablet. Slowly, with a deliberate grace that made the air in the room feel heavy, the most powerful man in the city dropped to one knee. It was the same position he had taken on that rainy street, but the context had shifted entirely. He wasn't reaching out to inspect a wound, he was offering a tribute. Between his fingers sat a band of platinum, set with a diamond as clear and cold as the winter stars. 10 years ago you gave me a reason to survive," he murmured, looking up at her with an intensity that made her heart skip. "Today, I am asking you to give me a reason to rule. I don't want a subject, Jae-yoon. I don't want a trophy in a golden cage. I want a queen." He held the ring out, his hand steady. "Stay. Not because you are afraid of the world, but because the world should be afraid of us." Jae-yoon looked at the ring, then at the man who had become her savior and her partner. She reached out, her fingers brushing his, and felt the power of the choice she was making. She wasn't just accepting a ring, she was accepting a reign. "Yes," she whispered, her voice a vow that echoed through the silent penthouse. As he slid the ring onto her finger, the transition was complete. The florist was gone, and in her place stood the first lady of the syndicate, the woman who had survived the shadows to claim the light.